What can history tell us about China's current global ambitions? Howard French will be here to talk about his new book, Everything Under the Heavens.
In international relations theory and political science, there's something called realism. And realism says that powers seek to maximize their power.
How can books help prepare us for death and grieving? Our Help Desk columnist, Judith Newman, will be here to talk about the latest books on coping with loss.
As a writer, you like the idea that you can work your way out of a difficult situation by storytelling.
Plus, we'll talk about what we and the wider world are reading. This is Inside the New York Times Book Review. I'm Pamela Paul. Howard French joins us now. His latest book is called Everything Under the Heavens, How the Past Helps Shape China's Push for Global Power. And it's reviewed this week on the cover of the New York Times Book Review. Howard, thanks for being here.
Great to speak with you, Pamela.
So let's start with the title, because there's a reference here that American readers might not necessarily get. What does that mean, Everything Under the Heavens?
Tianxia is a classical concept of Chinese geopolitics and power, and I have translated it in this way. Tian means heaven, Xia means beneath, and I have sort of updated the typical academic translation of this phrase, which was all under heaven, to what sounds more comfortable to my ear, everything under the heavens.
That's the same root then of Tiananmen, the Tian in Tiananmen Square.
That's correct.
What does that mean, now that we're getting into translations?
Tiananmen is the gate of heavenly peace, so you have that same heaven there.
Well, that makes this book sound a lot more positive and optimistic than it probably is. So let's talk about what the book is actually about. Your last book was about China's sort of incursion into Africa, immigrants into Africa and the role they're playing there. Did that book lead you into this one, or is this something that you've wanted to write about since you were a correspondent in China?
So this book actually proceeds from an older set of thoughts. By way of deep journalistic background, I spent 22 years at the Times, most of which were overseas. And in my early overseas period, I covered Africa for the Times. I was also, prior to that, a freelancer in Africa before I joined the Times. And so when I moved with the Times from Africa, West and Central Africa, to Northeast Asia as the Tokyo bureau chief covering Japan and the two Koreas, I was impressed that this new part of the world to me, meaning Northeast Asia, had much less of a kind of institutional tissue or framework of cooperation than did much less well-developed African countries. That the African regions have trade unions and customs unions and all sorts of multilateral institutions, and that Northeast Asia, much more highly developed, much older nations, had very little by way of interstate cooperation. And so that was the initial spark. Why is that? What's the reason for it? How can you explain this? And this idea kind of began to grow and evolve very gradually from that interrogation and set me ultimately on the path of trying to understand what is peculiar about the history of Chinese power and of Chinese geopolitics. And in this book, Everything Under the Heavens, I go a long ways back to the Han Dynasty, which begins in the 2nd century BC, and try to understand Chinese statecraft from the root, and to say what has China's culture of its own place of the world been like over a very long period of time, and how does that shape or condition present-day Chinese attitudes and Chinese ambitions?
I want to tie together just for a second before talking specifically about this current book, your most recent book and this one, in that when you talk about China's relations with its neighbors, it's also interesting that there are so many Chinese immigrants, of long standing in most of China's neighboring countries, so that there's a significant portion of Chinese in Vietnam and in Thailand and in the Philippines, and that they play a particular role there. And I'm wondering if that colors the relationship that China has with those countries.
It does very much, and in two very distinct ways. One of them is that this notion of Tianxia, which we didn't pursue any further beyond the introduction of the translation of it, is essentially a proposition that China says, that the Chinese empires have said, if you accept our superiority and our centrality, we will bestow upon you the fruits of our great civilization, which are peerless. And so in pre-modern times, this was a kind of expression of Chinese soft power. bow before the emperor and we will give you all of these goodies, which included philosophy, medicine, astronomy or astrology, religion, all sorts of other cultural goodies. And so the Chinese immigrant populations, which have, as you said, a very long history in a number of neighboring cultures, were often the bearers of a lot of these soft power goodies. The other way I would touch upon this, though, is quite distinct from that, and that is that if over the ages, as large numbers of Chinese peoples have emigrated to nearby places, they have constituted a under-the-cover kind of force within the society, a way of leveraging Chinese power within non-majority Chinese societies, and in other words, keeping these societies in check. These Chinese minorities sustain their identity as Chinese people and have a very strong relationship with the mother culture and act as a kind of balancing force in China's favor very often within these neighboring states.
There's a lot more to talk about in that, but I will go back to the central idea of your current book, which is, I'm assuming, goes beyond what we in the U.S. often think of as China's ambition, which we, I think, here see primarily in economic terms. But you're talking about a lot more than that.
Yes. Going back to the Han Dynasty, when I argue a lot of even our most up-to-date Chinese concepts of statecraft and geopolitics began to be formed, China has always seen itself, and almost always rightfully, as the biggest society, the society of greatest wealth and of greatest cultural and technological achievement in whatever is at any given moment the known world. The known world in ancient times was, of course, nearby neighboring societies for the most part. The known world in modern terms is the entire world, because we live in a globalized society. And so the Chinese obsession since the mid-19th century has been, how do we return to this state where we are preeminent in the known world? And they see the 19th century as a parenthesis or an aberration, when China was set upon first by European powers and then by Japan and laid low and robbed of its position, its rightful position in the hierarchy of things internationally. And so with contemporary China, and particularly under the present-day leader, Xi Jinping, you have seen an explicit expression of this very old desire dating to the 19th century of a resumption of what, to the Chinese popular imagination, is very much the deserved and rightful and, in fact, historic position that China has enjoyed and should enjoy in the world. And so your question really is, what does this mean beyond economics? And the argument that I make in my book is that there is a very serious security component to this, that China sees control of its nearby seas. It sees preeminence in its nearby seas as an absolute requirement for this restoration that we've been talking about. There's this cliche about generals always wanting to refight the last war. Well, China in the 19th century, when it was laid low, as it sees it, by outside powers, neglected the development and utility of maritime power. The British in particular showed up in the Opium Wars and sailed up the Yangtze River with heavily armed warships and were able to overwhelm the Chinese. And so the Chinese now, in part for those reasons, are obsessed with this idea of refighting those sorts of scenarios and saying only by developing a world-class navy and maritime presence in the nearby seas can we achieve all of our goals, and the most important goal, again, is restoration of Chinese preeminence in its immediate region.
How do you define that region? I mean, it seems that every couple of years in recent decades, there's been a sort of sense that China is posing a major threat in the South China Sea, and then it recedes from at least our consciousness here in the U.S. for the most part. But what is it that they're trying to do there?
Modern Chinese ambitions in the South China Sea have proceeded in a kind of stop-and-start way since the end of the Vietnam War, the American Vietnam War, when China has cycled through phases of assertion and even aggression. It fought some small maritime battles with Vietnam over some of the Paracel Islands right after at the very end of the Vietnam War. And then moments of conciliation and kind of pushing diplomacy and harmony in that area. But I think that if you step back and take the sort of broad view of things, China's sense, and there's a lot of Chinese rhetoric that reflects this, is that the South China Sea, by right, belongs to it. That doesn't necessarily mean that we'll see China wishing to expel every neighboring state from the South China Sea, but it, I think, very much means that China wishes, its ideal, its goal is to see the United States Navy unseated from its contemporary post-World War II preeminence in what's called the Western Pacific. And so this is a very large geographical area that stretches essentially, we've been speaking explicitly about the South China Sea, but I think these ambitions cover even a greater expanse of maritime space that goes from the Korean Peninsula all the way to Malaysia and Indonesia. So, and if you imagine the map of that region, you see an arc of archipelagos, essentially. The Korean Peninsula, followed by Japan, followed by the Philippines, followed by Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand. China sees the waters between that elongated archipelago and the Chinese mainland as essentially as an inland sea, and it calls that area the first island chain, speaking of that archipelago. And I assert, and I think Chinese rhetoric reflects this, and Chinese actions increasingly reflect this, China's ambition is to become preeminent in the near future in this part of the world.
So since your argument is that a lot of this global push is based on China's past, what is the precedent for that? On what do they base this idea that maritime region belongs to them?
Well, so the history doesn't actually back them up in the sense that, China's only argument, historically based argument in this regard, is one that it uses in lots of disputes with neighbors, and that is, we're the oldest civilization around, therefore we have rights that predate your rights. We were navigating these waters long before you were, et cetera, et cetera. This is ahistorical because it assumes that peoples who lived in the Philippines before there was a state called the Philippines, or people who lived in Malaysia before there was a state called Malaysia, or not to mention Japan, didn't venture out from their coasts into the ocean. Of course they did. Just because they don't have a continuous history that involves documentation of that, and in the case of the Philippines and Malaysia, in ancient times, a written script and volumes of classics in libraries that refer to things like this, doesn't mean that they had no presence in those waters. These were maritime societies, particularly the Malay peoples of the Malaysian, Indonesian, southern Thai region. These were seafaring nations that traded over long distance, including with China, and they were very accomplished in terms of their maritime prowess. So there is no real true historic basis for these claims on the part of China. The other thing that China is doing, though, and this is rather more sort of an argument that's more advanced more on the sly, is it is essentially following in the footsteps of the United States in the late 19th century and early 20th century in pursuing a kind of latter-day Monroe Doctrine. And it sees the Monroe Doctrine very much as a legitimizing precedent for it, that if America as an emerging great power was allowed to do this and its actions were seen as in that day as more or less normal, then why shouldn't it be normal for China, an even greater power in the Chinese sense, in their own sense of themselves, given its history? Why shouldn't China be able to have a kind of special privileges in its immediate surrounding waters?
How do countries today that have much less robust economic and military resources like Vietnam and the Philippines, how are they dealing with this increased incursion by China into their territory?
Well, I think there's an argument to be made that China has, I spoke about this stop-and-start cycle of assertion and apaisement or lowering the temperature, that China has made, in my view, a kind of a strategic blunder in the last few years under Xi Jinping. It has overinterpreted its sway in the region and its ability to get other countries to sort of bow before it, and has incited them, many of them, to seek ways of greater cooperation on the one hand, and the raising of their own military and security awareness or wariness. So you have seen, because of these accelerated claims and greater assertion on the part of China, a kind of hastening of intra-region cooperation among all sorts of states: Vietnam and India, Vietnam and China, Vietnam and Philippines, Japan and the Philippines, Japan and Vietnam, Malaysia and the Philippines, Indonesia and some of these other countries, all of which are now seeking ways, because they share a common concern about China's assertiveness and these ahistorical arguments that, if interpreted in an extrapolated way, mean dire things for each of them. They are looking for ways of fending China off. And my own sense of this is that China has hurt its own interests to a certain extent in inciting this wariness so strongly. It has accelerated the day when these other countries, most of which have not had a very strong maritime security presence in the region, it has hastened the day when they've determined that they simply can't afford not to become maritime powers themselves. And so now China is going to find itself, although it has vastly greater means than any single one of those countries, in an environment where pretty much all of the neighborhood is seeking to enhance its security, and almost all of the neighborhood with China in mind.
So the Southeast Asian nations, along with Japan and other countries in the region, it sounds like they're well aware of this threat. But you could imagine over here in the U.S., someone taking a kind of shrugging, isolationist position of saying, well, what's wrong if, in fact, China expands its sort of purview, its control in that region? What does it matter to the U.S.?
The most commonly heard answer is that this is the region of most rapidly increased prosperity in the world, and that the trade upon which this prosperity is based is almost entirely maritime-based trade. And so to allow China to control that and potentially to exclude other powers, most especially the United States, from within this first island chain, meaning the large body of water we talked about before, would be not just a menace potentially to any regional adversary of China, but would be a very big blow to American power. The United States has been the guarantor of all sorts of international arrangements globally, obviously, but also most specifically in this very region since the end of World War II. So if China is able to achieve this, to become absolutely paramount in its region and to push the United States back beyond the first island chain, then what will China do next? I'm not necessarily prepared to answer that question, but in international relations theory and political science, there's something called realism. And realism says that powers seek to maximize their power. And so if step one in maximizing your power is to become absolutely dominant within your region, your home region, then a realist would say that this then frees you up to then begin seeking to maximize your power beyond your region. And the United States fought a world war, notably the Second World War, precisely to prevent that sort of thing from happening, to prevent Germany from becoming unquestionably preeminent in its region, meaning obviously Europe, and to prevent Japan from doing the same within its region. And one of the sort of premises behind the American involvement was that if we don't fight them in their home regions, we're going to end up having to fight them in our home region or much closer to our home region. I'm not quite prepared to say that in 20 years or 30 years that's going to happen with China, but I don't think it's an unreasonable question to ask oneself, and I sort of conclude my book in part in asking that question.
Well, and it brings us right back to the title of your book, Everything Under the Heavens, which I imagine is the sort of the worst case or the most extreme example of where that might go.
Absolutely.
All right, Howard, thank you so much for being here.
Wonderful speaking with you, Pamela.
The book again is Everything Under the Heavens, How the Past Helped Shape China's Push for Global Power by Howard French. Judith Newman joins us now. She is our Help Desk columnist and also the author of a forthcoming book, To Siri with Love, A Mother, Her Autistic Son, and the Kindness of Machines, which is coming out later this summer. Judith, thanks for being here.
Thank you very, very much.
And that book started off as a modern love.
Well, actually, it started in the style section, yeah. It's just a piece about my son and what it is to the benefits of technology for a lot of people who are communication impaired.
All right, then. We will talk more about that later. For now, we have the not especially fun, but important subject of self-help books that address the issues of death and grieving.
You don't find that fun? I find that just a laugh riot.
Okay. So there are 6 books in this roundup. I'm just going to go quickly through the titles so people know what we're talking about, and then we can talk about each one. The first one, I think, is actually the last one you talk about in your review, but it's getting a lot of attention right now. It's a memoir by Nina Riggs called The Bright Hour, a memoir of living and dying. And actually, I think this also started off as an essay in the style section. But the first book you talk about is Good Grief, Heal Your Soul, Honor Your Loved Ones, and Learn to Live Again by Teresa Caputo. There's also Resilient Grieving, Finding Strength and Embracing Life After a Loss That Changes Everything by Lucy Hone. Getting Grief Right, Finding Your Story of Love in the Sorrow of Loss by Patrick O'Malley with Tim Madigan. John Abraham's How to Get the Death You Want, A Practical and Moral Guide. And Extreme Measures, Finding a Better Path to the End of Life by Jessica Nudek-Zitter. That's kind of astounding that so many books on this subject are coming out pretty much around the same time.
Maybe it's the baby boomer generation where we're thinking, and even though those of us who are a little bit younger than that are spending a lot of time thinking about this. We talk about how we want to live, but at this point we also want to talk about how we want to die. What we think is important in this area of life.
So basically, baby boomers are going to write all the books on this subject, and then the Gen X writers will have nothing to write. Is the way the writer in me looks at it.
Oh, that's an interesting theory. No, I think that they'll have their time too. Maybe there'll be a lull, and then all of a sudden you're just going to see these endless books about death and dying. But there always have been books about the subject. It's not as if this is new, but it just happens we've got a big crop right now. I
think in particular 2 recent books that became huge bestsellers have probably brought out more books on the subject. There was Being Mortal by Atul Gawande, which was a major bestseller for a long time on the bestseller list. More recently, Paul Kalanithe's book, When Breath Becomes Air.
Right. Well, I think in this particular crop of books, Extreme Measures is the one that looks at the issue from a physician's point of view. It's very interesting because Jessica Zitter is a doctor whose specialties are both palliative care and emergency room. It's kind of like the yin and yang. You know, she's the person who, if you come to her with an axe in your head, she's going to get that axe out and save you. On the other hand, so all of her instincts are about saving. And yet she gives a wonderful and very well-reasoned book about how we have to give a lot more thought and a lot more of our attention to letting go. Mm-hmm. And she talks about this at great length. She talks about how she realized it when she was a young resident and she was called in to rescue a man who was essentially dead. But nobody, and it reminded me of why I didn't go to medical school. It's the most gruesome description of pumping, of pressing someone's heart and breaking their ribs as they do it, and blood pouring out of the cavity, just because that's what is expected of doctors. Horrific, but makes her point very well about what we need to do as a culture to talk about death and dying.
So is she approaching it primarily from a medical point of view in terms of like when do you cease with medical interventions, or is there another component to the book?
No, it's a lot about that, and it's a lot about choosing many of the things that we think of as the most loving and nurturing things are kind of antithetical when you're dying. She has a wonderful description of a man who is very determined to feed his mother as she is dying. And he needs to feed and she needs to accept his love. And they're doing it through a tuna fish sandwich. And it's heartbreaking because essentially he makes her aspirate just by eating a tiny bit more, and thus shortened her life and shortened the time they had together out of love. And that is her main point, that we do that very often. Out of love, we make decisions that we shouldn't. I have a friend who's an oncologist who said to me that the children with the most fraught relationships with their parents are the ones who demand the most interventions, because they understand if their parents are dying, they have so much guilt or so much embarrassment about things in their life that they don't always make the best decisions for their parents. And it's out of love.
And guilt.
And guilt.
The other books that you looked at are less about the sort of medical side and more about the psychological, emotional, even spiritual side. And with that last one, I think the one that comes to mind most is Good Grief, Heal Your Soul, Honor Your Loved Ones, and Learn to Live Again, by Teresa Caputo, who bills herself as the Long Island medium.
Yes, she has a television show. It's been on for years. And I sort of love this book. The whole thing is interesting to me because I was out with a friend who actually a few years ago wrote about the same subject. She wrote a book called The Afterlife Connection. And while we were having lunch the other day, her dog had just died. And she was showing me pictures of these clouds in the sky that she was convinced were her dog Puffy speaking to her from the beyond. Now, this is a woman of science in many ways. She's a respected psychologist. And it made me realize when you start talking about the afterlife, you just naturally sound like a crazy person. But I think that we should get comfort wherever we can. And whether or not you wholly 100% believe in an afterlife is almost immaterial. I say here that Teresa Caputo, her dead people, who she calls spirit, they actually behave much better than our live people in a lot of ways. They want the best for you. They don't like you to whine. They don't like you to wallow too long in grief. They want you to get on with your life. But they are kind of speaking to you, and she doesn't see them as being far away. She sees the dead people as being like in a waiting room.
So, okay, given that she bills herself as the Long Island medium, how literal is she about this?
She's pretty literal.
But you read it on a metaphorical level.
I read it on a metaphorical level, and on that level, I found it very comforting. You know, I got to think about my own parents and the idea of them kind of hovering near me in a kind of a tissue paper separation rather than some far-off distance place was very comforting. And
for some people, that would be very disturbing, but I'm glad that that's comforting to you.
Yeah, well, I guess it just depends on the time of day. Maybe at 3 a.m. it wouldn't be so good. I'm not sure.
Just reading about the sort of, I guess, the story that inspired or spurred Lucy Hone to write her book is upsetting. The book is Resilient Grieving, Finding Strength and Embracing Life After a Loss That Changes Everything. What happened to Lucy Hone?
Well, she lost her child. She was, to begin with, a happiness researcher, and she lives in New Zealand. And this was her area of expertise, but when her child was, I believe, 12, was in a horrible car accident and died. She had other children. She had a very busy life. She wanted to look at the issue then of what role resilience plays in our life when something unimaginably awful happens. And she did. So this is a book, both a personal story and a book about the science of grieving. And I say that this book is for, I don't want to say it's tough love exactly. It's not. But it's for people who don't feel that they have the time to just completely fall apart for a long time. And it's concrete ways of picking yourself up and moving on with your life. One example, she's got other young children at home. So you can't take to your bed in these kind of situations. And she talks about the importance of routine for those kids and for herself, and how creating a routine, no matter how you may feel emotionally, may actually in some instances carry you through.
What was the best takeaway that you got out of this book?
I think the best takeaway was the idea that resilience as a human emotion, while it does have a genetic component to it, it is very common. And I took a certain amount of solace in the idea that most of us can actually recover from what seems to be unimaginably awful.
All right, let's go to our next uplifting tale, Getting Grief Right, Finding Your Story of Love and the Sorrow of Loss by Patrick O'Malley with Tim Madigan. This sounds in a way like a kind of combination of the last two books, but perhaps it's not. What is this one about?
It is. I think this book appealed to me because as a writer, you like the idea that you can work your way out of a difficult situation by storytelling. Here again, there was loss from the writer. He lost his infant son, and he was a psychologist. What he found out was that the typical Kubler-Ross stages of grieving, which are denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and finally acceptance, didn't work for him, that there was nothing about grieving that was linear. It was more of a kind of an oscillation of feeling. He read something that Isaac Dinesen wrote, which was basically that all sorrow can be born if you put them in a story or tell a story about them. And he really took that to heart. So what he encourages his patients to do when they've lost someone they love is to tell everything about the story about that person, and to tell it in a kind of narrative that they can pass on to other people.
The idea of it being an oscillation rather than a linear process seems to make utmost sense to me.
To me, too.
Moving on to the next book, John Abraham's How to Get the Death You Want, a Practical and Moral Guide.
I thought that this book, it's very nuts and bolts, and it is literally about that. This man is a thanatologist, and he works with the Final Exit Society. So if you want one book that's going to tell you the least messy and easy way to go out of this world, this is the one to do it. I admit that the idea of my final moments with a helium mask on and putting it around my neck and all of this stuff was a little hard to imagine because I'm not very coordinated at the best of times, and I just have a bad feeling that this would all backfire. However, if that is not you, he will tell you how to do this. And what I particularly liked about this book was he had a wonderful phrase. Instead of calling it assisted suicide, he called it life completion. And I think that I love it when language is not euphemistic, but when it's an accurate new expression. And that's one I particularly like.
That is very good.
Isn't that good?
All right. Let's end with a book that, from your review, it sounds like you thought pretty extraordinary. The Bright Hour, a memoir of living and dying by Nina Riggs.
It's a really beautiful book, and there's one portion of it that just sticks in my mind. It's at that point where she realizes that there's no going back, that her cancer is metastatic. And her husband is saying, they're both lying in bed one night, and her husband is saying, I can't wait for things to get back to normal. And she realizes that there isn't going to be a normal anymore. And she says to him something that we could all perhaps think about when we have a loved one who is facing this, or we are. And she said, thinking that way kind of invalidates my whole life. I have to love these days in the same way I love any other. And she did. And it's a beautiful book.
All right. Well, let's end on that. That book again is The Bright Hour, a memoir of living and dying by Nina Riggs, along with 5 other books on grieving and loss and coping with death, both of others and eventually yourself, that Judith Newman heroically reviewed this week in her Help Desk column. Judith, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you very, very much for having me. Just as a note, I'm not planning on dying, so I hope you all understand.
Excellent. Excellent plan. Joining us now to talk about what we're reading, my colleagues, Greg Coles and Jen Salai. Hi, guys.
Hi, Pamela.
Let's start with you, Jen, because you're reading 2 books.
Yes. So I'm actually just at the tail end of finishing up Masha Gessen's Man Without a Face, which came out a few years ago, and it's a biography, essentially, of Putin. Although Gessen herself, who was a journalist in Russia at the time of his ascent, is sort of a large participant in the book. And I was reading it partly because I just found a copy on one of the shelves and I was curious. And also just sort of contextually, I just wanted to know a little bit more about him because he's been in the news for a number of reasons.
She's continued writing about him as a journalist well after this book. Yeah.
And she interviewed him, right?
Yes, she does mention that she interviewed him. And one of the things that's also very interesting about this book is that she sort of traces his ascent, which, at the beginning wasn't really assured. I mean, it does seem to be the case that after communism collapsed in the Soviet Union, that he sort of stepped into this leadership vacuum and was essentially, a hand-picked successor to Yeltsin, which was also fascinating.
And the other book that you're reading?
The other book that I'm reading is, and I've just started this one, is Tim Weiner's Enemies, which is a history of the FBI. And so I'm just right at the beginning. Hoover has just been installed as director. He's maybe almost 30 at this point, but he's been at the FBI for a number of years, starting when he was like 23 or 24. And at the point in the book where I'm at, the Palmer raids have just started. And so...
What are the Palmer raids?
So the Palmer raids...
Ignorant in the audience.
Unlike Greg Coles, who knows exactly what the Palmer raids are.
So the Attorney General at the time, Mitchell Palmer, was essentially tasked with going after radicals within the United States. And so radicals at the time were considered communists, anarchists. Emma Goldman was one of them who was deported. And so right now I'm just at the point where they're discussing what happened then.
That's so interesting. I've read this year the David Grann book, The Killers of the Osage Moon, I think it was called.
Which I really want to read.
Yeah, and that gets a lot
Flowers
into...
of the Killer Moon?
The Killers of the Flower Moon, maybe. About
Do you have a version,
Osage...
Jen, to share? Because this is getting poetic.
It also gets very much into the early days of the modern FBI, not so much its founding, but the days when Hoover took over as director and kind of made it into a sleek, modern crime-fighting force.
Right. And he was there, for almost 5 decades, which
crazy.
Is astonishing.
Yeah.
I feel like you're the model pupil this week, Jen, for doing what we at the Book Review like to think everyone should do, which is to look back at books to get a better understanding of our current moment.
Well, I think it's just been so bewildering right now that anything that provides some sort of analogy, guidance, I don't know, context.
Right. It's either explanation or escape.
Right.
Which category do you fall into?
I'm the opposite of the model student. I'm squarely in the escape category. And continuing on a little bit of a trend that I've been doing in my reading lately, you'll remember that I read Jim Harrison's Legends of the Fall, which concludes with a historical novella that opens at the start of World War I. And then I moved into an anthology of World War I writings that the Library of America brought out, edited by A. Scott Berg. And now I'm still reading about the early days of the 20th century, kind of leading up to the start of World War I. Alexander Heman has a novel called The Lazarus Project. It came out almost 10 years ago, and I bought it when it came out in paperback, and then it sat on my shelf unread until just recently. The Lazarus Project, it's kind of this two-strand narrative. Lazarus, of the title, is an immigrant to America from Sarajevo. He would have probably been considered a radical. He's killed at the home of the Chicago police chief and passed off as a would-be anarchist assassin who's killed there.
This is escapism?
Yeah, I was going to say.
Well, it's escapism from the current moment, going back into the turmoil of a century ago. And so the second strand is set more in the present day with a writer very much like Alexander Heman, who becomes fascinated with the story of this immigrant, Lazarus, and tries to reconstruct his life. And so Lazarus, of course, has the double meaning of bringing him back to life now. And so, Heman is just such a terrific prose stylist. He learned English, for the most part, after he had himself immigrated here from Sarajevo. And so obviously he has a personal connection to this story. And, became a published novelist after he started studying at, I think, the University of Chicago, and then stayed here after all of the problems in Bosnia and Serbia the Civil War that broke out there. And he is just a pleasure to read sentence to sentence. So that's what I'm reading. How about you, Pamela?
Let me tell you about pure escapism over here. So I'm reading a book that came out in 1945 by Betty MacDonald called The Egg and I, and it was a huge bestseller at the time. It's still in print. I think Harper Perennial put out a paperback edition last in 2008. But I found my copy at the library, and one of the things that I love about it is that it's this really terrible but wonderful old library copy. And they've sort of pasted in on the front inside some clips from reviews at the time of The Egg and I, which the New York Times reviewed when it came out. But I will read from Clip Boutel of the New York Post's review. He called it a delectable omelet, feather-light social comedy edged with crisp satire and seasoned with chopped chives of good old common sense. It is served with an irrepressible gay irreverence, a bright, light, laughing book, not to be missed, unquote. So there we have pure escapism. And it's a memoir that some people consider, although I don't know that that's true, sort of one of the first real person memoirs, by Betty MacDonald, who many people will probably most know today because she is the author of the Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle books for children.
I love those books.
Well, then you will love The Egg and I. It is a delectable omelet of
with chives.
Yes. So she moves outside of Seattle into the mountains to start a chicken ranch with her husband, Bob, and she writes about it. And it's incredibly modern, really funny. The writing is so sharp. It's so good that I can't help but have to read two little excerpts. So this one is from a chapter called I Learned to Hate Even Baby Chickens. I mean, if that title chapter alone doesn't get you. So she is talking about the experience of brooding baby chicks. And she says, from my experience, I would supplement this prior to brooding advice to read, 4 weeks before brooding, leave on an extended trip to the Baranof Islands. She's reading a guide to how to raise these chicks. I well remember how the Lucrezia Borgia in me boiled to the surface as I read in my chick manual, quote, a single drink of cold water may be fatal to a baby chick, unquote. You don't say, I thought, licking my fevered lips and glancing longingly at the little lake filled with icy water. But my poultricidal tendencies were replaced with pure hysteria as I read on. Quote, water may be warm when you put it in the founts, but will it stay warm? Question mark, unquote. My God, isn't it enough that my hands will soon be dragging on the ground from carrying buckets and buckets and buckets of water, and that Stove has acquired a permanent list on his reservoir side without being further tortured with trick questions? Why don't you get underneath the brooder and see if the water stays warm, you big bore? Me, I'll fill the fountains with warm water and curses every 3 hours and take a chance. That was my reaction to my chick manual. The next cozy paragraph was headed Dopey Chicks. If many chicks are dopey and you are sure that they are not overheated or gassed, those chicks and the chicks that continually chirp should be sent to the nearest pathological laboratory. To see who's dopey? If the report says BWD, it is better to disinfect the premises and start new chicks, unquote. I could find no explanation of BWD, but to me it was code for the best news in the world. It might have been better to start new chicks, but it might have been best to take the next train for Mexico. I wondered how other chicken ranchers' wives reacted to baby chickens. Was there something in my background which kept me from becoming properly adjusted to the chicken, or was there just too wide a gulf separating a woman and a chicken? So she goes on about her hatred of baby chicks. But the thing that she makes fun of probably more than the chickens are the people that she's surrounded with. And she has these two neighbors. I don't know if she used pseudonyms or what, but I can't imagine what the reaction was in the local community to this book, because she is really unrestrained in her spot-on characterizations of her neighbors. She has the Hicks on one side and the Kettles on the other, and they're very, very different. And this is her description of the Hicks. Having Mrs. Hicks living in the community was akin to having Sherlock Holmes living in the outhouse and kept everyone watching his step. I was surprised when I learned that Bertie Hicks had a mother. She was so pure I thought perhaps she had come to life out of the house dress section of the Sears Roebuck catalog. But one warm evening that spring, I left Bob with the egg records and the baby and boldly struck out for Mrs. Hicks to stitch some curtains on her sewing machine. When I arrived, Mrs. Hicks, her mother, and Cousin June were sitting on the front porch, slapping at mosquitoes and discussing their miscarriages. After the introductions had been made, I sat down for a while before opening my brown paper parcel and exposing the real reason for my visit. This was considered good manners. For in the country where people only call to borrow or return or exchange, and everyone is hungry for companionship, it is considered very impolite to hastily transact your business and leave. You must exchange views on crops and politics if you are a man, gossip if you are a woman, then state your business, then eat no matter what time of day it is, then exchange some more politics or gossip, and at last unwillingly tear yourself away. I had sat on Bertie Hick's front porch for perhaps 2 minutes when I realized that, hungry as I was for companionship, this visit was going to be an ordeal. For Bertie's mother, a small, sharp-cornered woman with a short puff of gray hair like a gone-to-seed dandelion, tried so hard to be young that conversation with her was out of the question, and her ceaseless activity was as nerve-wracking as watching someone blow up an old balloon. When we were introduced, she said, tossing her head about on its little stem, quote, "Bet you thought I was Bertie's sister instead of her mother. 64 years young next Tuesday, and everybody guesses me under 40. Everybody does. It's 'cause I'm so active," unquote. Whereupon she shot out of her chair and leaped 4 feet off the ground after a mosquito. Coming down with the astounded mosquito in her little claw, she caught herself deftly on the balls of her feet, bent her knees so that she was almost squatting, then snapped into a standing position, turned, and winked at me. There we go.
That is
Ouch.
delightful.
It is like
so
that on
perfectly
every...
escapist.
It's perfectly escapist. At the end of every day, I just retreat into the sort of the
it's
mountains
got this sort
outside.
of like Peter Mails meets Shirley Jackson vibe going on.
Yeah. No, it's really pretty astounding, and I have to. It's one of those books that you really do have to suppress yourself from reading aloud every other sentence to whoever's standing next to you and to torture them. But Maria Semple had actually recommended this to me, and she said, "You will die of 1,000 cutenesses on every page." But it's like the good kind of cuteness. It's not the trickly kind of cuteness. It's sharp cuteness.
Yes.
All right then, Jen, Greg, thanks for joining
Pamela.
us.
Thanks, Pamela.
Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books, and you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. Inside the New York Times Book Review is produced by Pedro Rosado. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm Pamela Paul.